Which cryptocurrency projects are decentralized? Please tell me now. Are you sure? Are they really decentralized? How can you measure and assure that? Is it because the block production is decentralized? But let's say that the blocks are produced by several different miners or validators, but what if those miners and validators are run by the same company? Are they still decentralized? But even if they are run by different companies, what if all these companies are using the same software or the same servers? Would you consider it to still be a decentralized blockchain? It's not that easy. It's not that easy to define decentralization because real decentralization implies that the protocol is decentralized at every level. Okay, and sometimes a blockchain can be very decentralized in terms of validators, but could be very centralized in other areas such as softwares or decision making. And that is not real decentralization, because there is still just one major point of failure that can lead the blockchain to fail or even disappear. Who knows? So in this video, the goal is to dive deep into decentralization, talk a little bit of why it's important, some of the most common metrics we have right now to analyze decentralization, and also a new and more complete and well-rounded metric that's being developed to evaluate decentralization by the University of Edinburgh, and that is perfect for blockchain and cryptocurrency projects. As you've probably noticed by the name of my channel, I'm a big fan of decentralization. I believe it's super important, and for me, it's probably one of the most valuable characteristics of blockchain and one that we cannot give up on. Okay, because blockchain, after all, was created to allow for different parties that don't trust each other to transfer value within them and without the need to use an intermediary or a third party. But for that to happen, we need to make sure that the underlying protocol is impartial and fair and people can trust it. Okay, and the best way is for it to be decentralized. Okay, so that there is no one that controls it, no one that dictates the rule of the protocol. In fact, it is kept by all people, and all people want to ensure its fairness. Okay, and it's good. We cannot have protocols. If a protocol has a single entity that would control and have the power to alter transactions, control emissions, and the underlying currency, or even the parameters and rule of the blockchain, it would never be a protocol we wanted to be a part of, and we would never trust it to do our transfers of value and or even to store our value there. So that's why it's really, really important to have a decentralized blockchain, and this is what it is. Decentralization is simply to remove the power from a centralized entity and basically giving this power back to in the hands of the people, of everyday users, of everyday investors. That's the real definition of decentralization. Centralization creates a unique point of failure. Much like the Death Star in Star Wars, it was a super well built, super strong machine spaceship that was equiparable to a planet. But if you would find that right spot, that weakness, and you would shot a single shot into the vacuum, it would explode in a million pieces, and everything would be deleted, destroyed, I would say. And a blockchain is kind of like that. If you have a single point of failure and you have centralization, you just need to be able to affect that single point of failure, to control, to persuade somehow this single point of failure. You can do whatever you want, and that is certainly a great danger, and that's not secure. You know, that's why there is a need for decentralization, because it increases the robustness of the protocols. Protocols get safer, you can trust them. It eliminates single points of failure because you spread. There is a bunch, for example, in a blockchain, there's a bunch of validators guaranteeing that everything is fine. And even if one validator goes down or he tries to corrupt the network, the other ones will be there to correct him, to cover for him if he's down, and to make sure the blockchain will keep working with no problems at all. And that's the great one of the great benefits of decentralization. But besides that, it increases fairness and impartiality because there are rules set by the blockchain that are guaranteed and kept by everyone that is validating this blockchain, and these rules cannot be messed with unless everyone agrees. And I think that's once again getting the power back into the people. And finally, of course, everyone is subjected to the same rules. No one has an unfair advantage like sometimes it happens in the real world right now, where some institutions, some people have some benefits that regular people cannot access, either in terms of credits or even in terms of legislation. uh, but yeah, in blockchain, no. As long everyone is subjected to the same rules, and the protocol that is decentralized assures those rules are followed by everyone and are kept sane, without benefiting any specific party. Okay, so basically, blockchain really levels the playing field, and it's something we should want because, as I told you before, if the other entity, if it's controlled by a centralized entity, decentralized entity defines everything. It can mint tokens, it can burn tokens, it can freeze the tokens in your wallet, decide when and how you can spend them, if you can spend it at all, and even if you can save. They really have control over your wealth, your finances, and even like your privacy and all the information, because they can just ask you for QIC or all the kinds of information if you really want to be a part of this blockchain and move your funds. And you'll have to give them if you want to keep your funds. So, with a centralized entity, blockchain, instead of being a blessing, something that could make the world fairer and finance fairer and more accessible to everyone, it would be a curse that could be used against you by a central entity to make you do what they want, basically, because they would have total control over your data and your wealth. And I think that's almost like controlling our entire life. And this is one of the things that can happen with these CBDCs that are governed by centralized entities. But of course, that's a conversation for another day. So let's now focus on this decentralization index. That is something also very important and that will certainly help us choosing the best blockchains to have our funds on. The blockchains that are more secure, more stable, more trustworthy, more robust. So it's something that might not seem so important, but at the end of the day is really important. And yeah, and for that, right now we have some indexes to measure blockchain decentralization. They are not perfect, but the most common one and used and that people really um, think it's a good measure is the indexes is the Nakamoto coefficient, guys. So this is one of the most important metrics. This is a metric that basically considers the minimum number of nodes required to disrupt the blockchain. Okay, so how many entities exactly would we have to compromise before getting control of a blockchain, of more specifically a subsystem of the blockchain, because there are several systems, several subsystems that compose what is the entirety of a blockchain, from validators to developers, investors, a lot of things we need to consider when analyzing a blockchain. Naturally, in terms of the Nakamoto coefficient, the higher the coefficient, the better, the more decentralized and, and difficult to disrupt will be the protocol. This is not an easy to apply measure because different blockchains, have different thresholds for disruption. You really need to dive deep into the blockchain, dive deep into the functioning of the blockchain to understand these thresholds instead of just making up a number. Although it's common to people just say 51%, but 51% holds true for some blockchains like Bitcoin, but it doesn't hold true for all the blockchains. And also the different functioning of the blockchains really affect. It's important to understand the function to have a right interpretation of the data that you need to gather to analyze the disruption, and that's something that requires a lot of research as well into a certain blockchain that is not always easy to do. And of course, then there are the gathering of the subsystems. So you need to understand all the subsystems that make up the blockchain, and you need to measure and consider them, because one blockchain can rate real high in one subsystem, like it can be really good in terms of validators, but then if you go and you see the developers, you have a huge problem because there are almost no developers. So even though the blockchain rates very high in terms of validators, then in terms of building the blockchain, everything is very centralized, and they can basically define what the blockchain will be, and we need to trust them to make good decisions for us and build the right things for us. Okay, but yeah, basically, once we have the individual values that we gather from the subsystems, we just need to plot them on a Lorentz curve, on a graph, and we can identify the minimum number of entities we need for disruption. Okay, let's just show you an example, but guys, if you want, I'll have an article in detail where I gather a lot of this information from that explains this in more detail, and I'll share it with you in the description so you can take a look exactly of how the Nakamoto coefficient is calculated. Okay, but to give you a quick example of how the Nakamoto coefficient is calculated, first you need naturally to look at the data. Okay, guys, the data is super important, and we need to gather the data. For example, here in this case, we'll calculate the Nakamoto coefficient for Ethereum developers. Okay, so basically Ethereum, as you'll see in that article, they have two engineers that have made more than 51% of the commits. Okay, so just went to GitHub, saw the people doing commits to Ethereum, and they saw the number of commits and summed everything, and they saw that 51% of this engine, and they came to the conclusion that 51% of the commits were made by more than 51% of the commit were made by just two engineers. Okay, so in this case, if we measure the Nakamoto coefficient for developers would be just two. Okay, this is not good. It's very centralized. There's just two people you need to control, let's say, or influence to really be able to just define the development of the blockchain, or the major developments of the blockchain. So yeah, that's certainly a very low number. Okay, guys, but of course, like the Nakamoto coefficient is a very interesting metric, very useful, but it also has a lot of downsides. Okay, we need to consider. And first, one of the downsides is related to the relevant subsystems. It's very common for you when analyzing in a blockchain that people miss some of the subsystems that affect the blockchain. And if you do that, you might find that the blockchain is extremely decentralized in the coefficients you calculated and in the subsystems you calculated. But there are other subsystems that it is not, and that might lead this blockchain to fail you in the future. Okay, and you need to be very careful with that. Finally, no, furthermore, I would say we have the reliability of the data, okay, and the time period analyzed. Okay, these are two very important things. So reliability of the data, we really need to be sure that the data that we are getting is data that is, truthful, that is correct, and that's very important. And also the time period will influence a lot. We need to consider a time period. If we consider a longer time period, the results will be different from a shorter time period. So that's also very important, and something that is going to also influence a lot the interpretation of this data, and that is usually not considered. Okay, guys, but it's super important, especially because in blockchains things move fast. Blockchains are always developing and introducing new improvements that sometimes affect the Nakamoto coefficient, either to the downside or to the upside. So that needs to be considered, of course. And then we also need to realize who is behind this kind of calculations, because there are some companies, some that are fans of a certain blockchain or investors in a certain blockchain. They can have incentives to skew the data, and it's very easy to skew the data for a certain blockchain, just playing with the subsystems, playing with the thresholds, just choosing the data from a time period that is more favorable. There's a lot you can do that is still, that's not fraud, I would say, but it's kind of not intellectually honest, I would say, to skew the data in favor of the blockchains you want to support and that you're investing. And that's also something we need to consider, because there is right now there's no impartial entity taking care of these coefficients. Anyone can come and calculate his own coefficient, and because the other failure, it is a complicated statistical calculation. Not everyone, can exactly verify if that calculation is correct or not, and what kind of data did they use. If it, if you can, if the numbers are correct as yours, because most people cannot do this calculation, so they need someone to do it from them for themselves, and of course that is a risk. And then final thing is the misleading situation of the interpretations, because, for example, as I said, time period analyzed is very important. Okay. Also, people can see a very high Nakamoto coefficient for node producers, and they say, "Oh, this blockchain is super decentralized." But then the blockchain is using the same software for all node producers that just one company develops, and if that happens, in that metric, it's not centralized at all. So you're not that safe, and it can be really misleading to just look at the Nakamoto coefficient, especially if people are not well informed about what it is. Okay, and even in terms of data, I think it's very important to mention that data is very tricky. For sure, you can, for example, you can look at the miners addresses of a blockchain, and you see, whoa, so many miner addresses producing blocks, and you see, whoa, this coefficient, Nakamoto coefficient, is crazy. But then you go see those miner address who it belongs to, and many of them belongs to the same companies, the same entities, the same groups. And when you associate those miner addresses with the groups, or those validator addresses with the groups, then you see that the decentralization is not that high at all. So even in terms of interpreting the data, making the match of the data to the reality, there's a lot that can happen, and that will translate into very different results. And of course, that is something to consider with, and a big limitation of this Nakamoto coefficient. Nice. Okay. But of course, there is also hope, because there is a new indexes for the centralization of blockchains and cryptocurrency being developed by the University of Edinburgh. And this index basically just what they aim to do is to create a standardized, formal, and non-subjective process to measure decentralization, while guaranteeing that everything is consistent, equal, fair, and that the data is gathered in a similar way, okay, following similar process. So basically something standardized that you can trust in, that will be transparent in terms of data collection, in terms of the information and the process, and also something that will be done by a third party that has no interest except for learning interest in the area, that is the University of Edinburgh. So I think that's a really, really positive thing. Okay. And naturally, this index is thinking about using a lot of different metrics, from the Gini coefficient, the Nakamoto coefficient as well. And we can see here, in fact, some of these metrics, some of the calculations they're already doing to analyze this kind of blockchain and decide which metrics are more important to add into their index. Okay, guys? And we can see here some important metrics in green here below. Oops, sorry, I clicked and I shouldn't. We have the Gini coefficient. Okay, guys, Gini coefficient is basically a coefficient used in economics to measure income inequality. And basically, if the coefficient is 0, it means there is no income inequality. Everyone has the same income. And if the coefficient is 1, it means that one person holds all the income. Okay, so naturally, the higher, the more concentration there is, the lower, the more concentration, the less concentration there is. In terms of Bitcoin and the pooling analysis in terms of block production, 0.8% is the value for the Gini coefficient. So it means that just a few companies, okay, these are the companies, not the address, are responsible for mining the majority of the Bitcoin blocks that are in existence. Okay, so this is a considerably centralized metric in terms of this situation. We also have here those two graphs above in blue that are the Nakamoto coefficients. Okay, this is the Nakamoto's coefficients that are not clustered. So like the Nakamoto coefficient here means that for the first Nakamoto coefficient, it's talking about the just addresses, okay, just the mining pools, okay, while the one below is talking about entities, because there are entities that control more than one big mining pool. So that's important to consider. And as you can see here, the Nakamoto coefficient for just addresses, just pools, and not entities, goes from 3 to 5. So if you could get the 5, or right now, if you could get the in 2000, not right now, no, but in 2022, if you could get the three largest, the three or the four, but usually the three largest pools, you could control the mining pools, you could control the network. Okay, so that's a relatively high coefficient. And below in red, we have the Nakamoto coefficient in terms of percentage. Okay, so meaning that these entities that run the Nakamoto coefficient end up producing like 60% of the blocks. But yeah, these are some of the indexes they are considering to add with the Edinburgh Decentralization Index. But the process they are using to create this index is the following. They'll identify blockchains, they'll identify each layer of that blockchain and the relevant resources and parties that are in control of those resources. Okay, and once they have this distribution plotted in a graph, they will find metrics, okay, to provide an idea of a bigger picture. Okay, and those metrics will be then later compiled together and bundled together into a single index with a final value to compare the overall uh, level of decentralization of a blockchain. But you still have those metrics for each relevant part and layer of the blockchain that you can assess, and that will give you a lot of information about the blockchain. Okay, in my Twitter I also shared this post, okay, that shows a little bit about some of the things they are considering right now for the methodology of this index, like tokenomics, API, the consensus network. So really the tokens, the peers. So really interesting, and even in terms of governance. So yeah, it's something you should definitely take a look at in my Twitter. And finally, we also have here how the Edinburgh Decentralization Index will also work. Is that it, at the end of the day, you'll comprise all those metrics and you'll have a quantitative overall metric that analyzes the decentralization for that blockchain, but you'll also have the specific measures for each layer, as told before, to analyze better what is the blockchain really doing well and what it needs to improve. And finally, you'll also have some qualitative certifications for reaching certain well-defined requirements. Those are like badges, like, oh, you reach this area of decentralization, you reach this in a certain area of decentralization, you use a badge, that like a certification for good variables in terms of decentralization. Okay, and yeah, one thing that's very important is that this Edinburgh Decentralization Index is supposed to be continuously calculated and updated, okay? Because blockchain moves very fast, so this index will try to keep pace with the movements of blockchain. That's certainly gonna be tough, but let's see. I think it's going to be coded, this Edinburgh Decentralization Index, so there is a real chance you can update the data almost in real time. I would say that would be interesting to see if they can do that. Then it will mostly gather data from the blockchain, but it also, of course, can probably gather some data from blockchain analysis companies. I think they could have some interesting data about entities and the relevant users that could complete this analysis. So I do. It's not guaranteed, but I think it's something they're considering as well for their model. And they also have a specific research method and framework that will be transparent, okay, and that will allow to evaluate the decentralization of the blockchain. And in this method, after this method, there will be the definition of core metrics that will come from this framework and this method. This core metrics will be from economics, information theory, and network science. Okay, and after all, and above all, everything will be open source. So you can see how this decentralization index works. You can console like check the values at any time. There will be a dashboard for you to go through it and analyze it deeper. So I think it's going to be something very interesting because it will allow us to have a more complete, more fair, more transparent index to measure decentralization, and we can see which projects are really decentralized and in which metrics, and even overall how decentralized they really are. Okay, and this is, I think, is extremely valuable for any investor right now that wants to make sure they're not investing in securities, and they want to run away almost from the SEC and be don't have problems with that kind of issues, but is also, above all, super important in the long run as not only a crypto investor but a crypto user, for you to see which one are the best blockchains for you to put your money in, your hard-earned value in, and to exchange value, to accumulate wealth, to protect your capital, because the more decentralized, the more trustworthy, more robust the blockchain will be, and the less likely it is that it can be tampered with by any entity. And that's what you should look for if you want to have some control over your finances, over your wealth, and you don't want your wealth to be depleted and your purchasing power to be depleted as it has been in the last few years, with so much inflation, so much money printing that unfortunately doesn't benefit the common individual like you and me. Okay, guys. So yeah, don't if you like this kind of video, if it was useful, please subscribe, turn on the notification bell. I want you to join this decentralized nation if decentralization is something that matters to you, and if you want to learn more about crypto. And just tell me, are you excited about this Edinburgh Decentralization Index? Are there any other indexes that are important to be considered? Just please drop it in the comments. And if you have any kind of content you'd like to see, drop it in the comments as well. I'll try to answer your request, and maybe I can even make what you asked. Okay, so thank you and stay safe.